Hey, it's your old pal Lucid Stew again. We are continuing to look at the Federal Railroad Administration high-speed rail corridors. In this video, we will discuss the Gulf Coast Corridor. The Gulf Coast high-speed rail corridor spans 5 states, 4 of which border the Gulf of Mexico. The states involved are Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia. These states have a combined population of 52.5 million people, or about 1/6 of the total for the United States. The large majority of those people are in Texas. A feature of this combination is that Texas and Georgia on either end are populated and growing rapidly. Louisiana and Mississippi are much more rural, stagnant, and among the poorest states in the country. Alabama sits halfway between those paradigms. Such a project represents an interesting opportunity to stimulate 2 depressed states by better linking 5 economically. These states have a combined land area of about 480,000 square miles, which is larger than the land area covered by the 9-state Chicago hub network. If you haven't seen my video about that, check it out. Population density is 110 people per square mile, but this statistic is misleading. As the corridor stands now, it only connects the southeastern extremity of Texas, but this includes the Houston Metro and the border area around Beaumont. These areas represent 8 million people in an area about the size of Connecticut, and it's one of the densest parts of Texas. While the Atlanta Metro is geographically a small part of Georgia, the majority of Georgia's population lives there. The corridor covers large portions of the populations of Louisiana and Alabama as well. The exception is Mississippi because the corridor misses the state's most populated metro, Jackson, but I'll come back to that. The major metro areas fall into a few different tiers. Houston and Atlanta are among the largest metros in the country, both with more than 6 million people. New Orleans is one of the smaller large metros at about 1.25 million. Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and Birmingham, Alabama are large mid-sized metros not far below 1 million. There are several others that are smallish mid-size like Mobile, Alabama. Houston and Atlanta are 700 miles apart as the crow flies. Every major city on this corridor is within 120 miles of a straight line between the two. The corridor is a combination of the far southern portion of Amtrak's Crescent and the eastern portion of its Sunset Limited. As Atlanta is a potential meeting point for 4 different high-speed rail routes, it is a desirable endpoint for this one. Houston is an outlier in the Texas Triangle as it is not part of the South Central high-speed rail corridor. However, a high-speed rail connection between Houston and Dallas known as Texas Central Railway is in the works. This project has run into some difficulty, but it's still possible it will be built. Here is the full map of the intended Gulf Coast high-speed rail corridor. Like most Federal Railroad Administration high-speed rail corridors, high speed for the current concept is defined as 110 miles per hour with an aspiration of reaching 150 miles per hour sometime in the distant future. The idea is to iterate currently slow Amtrak service to higher and higher speed over time. Here, the current goal is mostly 90 mile per hour service, which usually averages 50 to 60 miles per hour where it exists. The gist of the high-speed rail corridor overviews on this channel is to suggest that we leapfrog that idea and go straight to true high-speed rail, averaging 140 to 160 miles per hour between major destinations. Let's look at some challenges this concept faces. Problem number 1, distance from Houston to Atlanta. The route is about 800 miles between the 2 large metro anchors. While it is desirable to connect the two in such a way, the distance favors air travel. Both metros have airports with very large capacity. Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International is the busiest airport in the country. George Bush Intercontinental in Houston is the 15th busiest. All things considered, a capable fast train between these two metros would be about 35% slower than flying. This places greater emphasis on the connections between the two, which a non-stop flight cannot make. The distance between Houston and Atlanta is less than ideal for the mode, but let's look at some other pairings in the system that fit within the 200 to 400 mile range where high-speed rail performs best. Houston to Baton Rouge, 270 miles. Houston to New Orleans, 340 miles. Baton Rouge to Mobile, 220 miles. New Orleans to Birmingham, 330 miles. Not a big list considering 15 possible pairings when throwing Mobile into the mix. You'll also notice Atlanta is conspicuously absent. It's about 150 miles east of Birmingham, which is its best connection. That's not the worst high-speed rail distance. However, it is 480 miles or more to every other major destination, which starts getting into flight distance. This is mainly due to the stretch between New Orleans and Birmingham being lightly populated, but I have a solution for that. Much like my Chicago hub network video, I'm going to deviate a little from the current route to design what I think would be a better system. Problem number 2, this is a 5-state project, so it needs significant federal leadership, coordination, and funding to happen. Currently, those are in short supply. Of the current studies covering the route, only the portion between Birmingham, Alabama and Atlanta, Georgia has been studied for true high speed. I assumed a similar route between the two in my cost and speed estimate. Problem number 3, the Gulf of Mexico. About half the intended route is near the Gulf of Mexico or crosses a major river floodplain or a swamp there. This presents some technical challenges as it relates to tropical cyclones and rising sea level. Of particular concern is the portion between Baton Rouge, Louisiana and Mobile, Alabama, as most of it lies within 10 miles of the shore, very near sea level and right in the crosshairs of hurricanes on an almost yearly basis. You're also dealing with a lot of sensitive wetland areas that are much more protected now than in the past, making it much more difficult to deviate from existing rights of way. In order to review and design this corridor, we need some guiding principles. I'll explain the benefit of each. Number 1, separate passenger and freight, especially away from urban and suburban areas. This allows higher max speed and cuts travel time between destination pairs. Number 2, utilize existing corridors. This includes passenger and freight rail as well as interstate highway rights-of-way. New rights-of-way will be necessary occasionally, but minimizing those avoids delays and additional cost from litigation. There are also utility corridors, but this would typically be a route which will make adjacent land cheaper rather than being able to use the corridor itself. Number 3, fairly straight rights-of-way that are completely grade separated in order to maintain high speed and safety. Number 4, avoid costly viaducts and tunneling if possible. We're just not great at performing either of these construction activities in the States cheaply, although viaduct will be impossible to avoid with all the necessary wetland crossings. Number 5, the core metro station should be in or very close to downtown areas in order to move from density to density and foster urban redevelopment. I've gotten some pushback on this one, so let's say when it's convenient and doesn't cause excessive slowing of through trains. Also, let's say when viable local transit alternatives don't exist. Number 6, connect to existing transit to foster intermodality, bolster regional transit, and ease congestion on roadways. Or hearkening to number 5 as a means of accessing otherwise difficult and expensive urban cores. Number 7, connect to international airports near the route when convenient for the same reasons as number 6, but also to increase the usefulness of the high-speed rail line to a given metro area and the region. Applying these principles, I came up with this system for about $98 billion. My methodology is simple and quick. It looks at the route, new or existing right-of-way, and if that runs through urban, suburban, or rural areas, underground, aerial trench, or at grade. Applied to the California High-Speed Rail Phase 1 route, I got $80.5 billion. Brightline West, I came up with $12.8 billion. These are both within 7% of official estimates with all factors considered, so I feel good about the method and the estimated costs I've settled on. $98 billion would be for a system of 1,147 miles of track connecting 2 major and 3 mid-sized metropolitan areas and several smaller mid-sized cities worth servicing. This is more than twice the track of California High-Speed Rail Phase 1 at about 80% of the cost. This is thanks to the largely level and rural nature of the route outside of the metros. I have evolved my outlook slightly and broken this system up into a full-speed main line and slower speed intercity lines. There would be about 892 miles of main line and about 165 miles of intercity. The main line would aspire to a top speed of 200 miles per hour and alter right-of-way geometry to fit when feasible. The intercity lines would be electrified and compatible with the main line, but with slower top speeds in the 80 to 150 mile per hour range that would conform to the geometry of existing rights-of-way and allow for more leeway on at-grade crossings. What kind of travel times would result? Let's take a look at a few examples. Atlanta to Birmingham, 145 miles in 1 hour 10 minutes at an average of 125 miles per hour. Birmingham to Jackson, 235 miles in 1 hour and 40 minutes at an average of 141 miles per hour. Jackson to New Orleans, 203 miles in 1 hour 15 minutes at an average of 162 miles per hour. Mobile to Baton Rouge, 191 miles in 1 hour 20 minutes at an average of 144 miles per hour. Houston to New Orleans, 340 miles in 2 hours 25 minutes at an average of 141 miles per hour. Atlanta to Houston, 816 miles in 5 hours 35 minutes at an average of 146 miles per hour. Most routes fall in the 140 to 160 mile per hour desired average range for this $98 billion cost. About $6 billion could be saved by more closely conforming to existing rights-of-way. Such a choice would result in roughly 15% slower average speeds between most areas, adding about 45 minutes to a trip between Houston and Atlanta. Given the amount of track, required destruction would be very minimal, given the adherence to existing rights-of-way and the rural nature of most of the path. Now let's look at some places where my concept differs from the current Gulf Coast high-speed rail corridor. My largest deviation is utilizing the Interstate 55 corridor between the Louisiana swamps and Interstate 20 instead of using the Interstate 59 corridor. The most obvious benefit of this change is the addition of Jackson, Mississippi to the route. This is the largest metro in Mississippi at about 600,000 people and provides an otherwise missing link in the middle of the route, which would open up the amount of viable city pairs in the overall route. Interstate 55 is also very straight and level, providing an extremely high-speed connector between the seaside and inland portions of the corridor. I have time between Interstate 12 and 20 at just 42 minutes while covering 132 miles. This would bypass Hattiesburg, Mississippi. The metro and urban population is about 1/3 of Jackson's. This could still be serviced by regional rail though. With this change and proposed intercity rail to Dallas along Interstate 20, southern Mississippi would have one of the best intercity rail networks in the country. I opted for two major mainline bypasses. Let's start with the smaller one, Birmingham, Alabama. Interstate 20 through the Birmingham Metro does not have a desirable geometry and would likely be limited to 60 miles per hour for a significant portion of its 30 miles through there. Interstate 459 to the southeast is much straighter and about 5% shorter. Traversing an Interstate 459 route would take about half the time of Interstate 20. Interstate 459 does thoroughly circumvent Birmingham, but we still want to service that urban core. We can use the Norfolk Southern right-of-way through the area at sub 80 miles per hour and not worrying about grade separation. This would make servicing both downtown Bessemer and Birmingham possible. They're about 12 miles apart. A connection to Birmingham Shuttlesworth International Airport would be difficult, but not impossible. I've not included that in my cost estimate, but it would probably be between $1 and $2 billion. The much more extensive mainline bypass involves New Orleans. I've opted not to put it on the main line. The city is just too dense to move through at speed. I've opted instead for Interstate 12 as the main line right-of-way. An intercity line would then travel from Interstate 12 in Baton Rouge along the I-10 corridor through New Orleans on surface rail and then back to Interstate 10 to hook up with Interstate 12 in Slidell. This is a favorable compromise for New Orleans on several fronts. Number one, you wouldn't need to destroy as much old stuff. Number two, thanks to the favorable geometry of Interstate 10 into and out of the area, it would still be quite fast. I have the 106-mile journey taking 1 hour 15 minutes with 3 stops. That would be an 85 mile per hour average as a local and the second fastest passenger rail in the country if it existed now, so not bad. Number 3, combined with the main line and a few compromised stations that would be bypassed by most trains, southeastern Louisiana would have the most competent regional rail system outside of the Interstate 95 corridor. Number 4, it would connect directly to the Louis Armstrong New Orleans International Airport. Downsides. The route through the city isn't the best, and local transit would need to be extended to any station site chosen to serve the city proper. In addition to the large bypasses for New Orleans and Birmingham, I also planned for 3 much smaller ones to service downtown Jackson, downtown Meridian, Mississippi, and the University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa. Other things to consider. I've imagined the Houston station adjacent to a multimodal station near downtown, and also with a possible direct connection to the planned Texas Central Railway Houston station. This would extend the network to Dallas, Texas, and provide a hypothetical connection to the South Central Corridor if built out. In my video about running high-speed rail between Charlotte, North Carolina and Atlanta, I proposed a station at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport and also discussed the possible utility of Interstate 285 as a ring rail bypass. While I have tunneling to downtown Atlanta built into our $98 billion Gulf Coast corridor cost, it would also be possible instead to create a joint station with METRA at their Westlake station 3 miles west of downtown. Instead of the tunnel to downtown, a line could be run down Interstate 285 south to the airport. Cost would be about $1 billion more than the downtown tunnel. More importantly, this would give us a connection to the largest airport in the country, and this would also facilitate extension to Charlotte. I had the cost to Charlotte pegged at about $40 billion. If you haven't seen that lower level analysis, check it out. All that would give you something like this. It's interesting to consider the future of high-speed rail in the United States, even if it's a little fanciful. We'll continue to do just that as we run through the remaining Federal Railroad Administration corridors in coming videos. Next up in this series is the Keystone Corridor in Pennsylvania, where we'll figure out if there's a reasonable way to traverse 80 miles of parallel mountain ridges at speed. I think the very next video will be a response to the question posed for a recent Industry Live panel event. What would it take to complete the California high-speed rail line in 5 years? Also, more high-speed rail city pair videos and Stu's news on the last Friday of September. But that's all for now. Until next time, I'll see you on that big beautiful freeway.